Hello, hello. Okay, it's been a while for me since I've done a video. Been pretty busy, and I have not been reading Exodus, which is where we're at. So I revised real quick, and we're going to do Exodus chapter 8 today, the plague of the frogs. Dun 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 dun. I can't read this without thinking about there's a Simpsons episode where Milhouse is Moses, and the frogs, all the Pharaoh and everybody just starts eating frog legs and everything. It's the first thing that comes to my mind every time the frog happens. Also, well, we'll get into it, but the amazing thing isn't necessarily the plagues, it's how quickly Moses gets rid of them. That's the real miracle, and I'll explain. But let's get going. New International Version, chapter 8, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom and unto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs. The frogs will come up on you, and your people and all your officials.'" Bum, 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 bum. Frogs. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt." So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and frogs came up and covered the land. But the magicians did the same things by their secret arts. They also made frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Alright, so real quick, let's remember what the last plague was. It was blood. All the water, everywhere turned into blood, okay? So let's think about this. These amphibious frogs that live in water, all their home has been destroyed. It's like an oil spill for them, only it's a blood spill. So of course they come up onto land. Like this, all these, we'll see, these plagues, they make sense logically in order. And this isn't an argument, obviously I'm a believer, against God and his divine power. It's showing that a lot of times God uses basic science. Like he wrote the laws of the universe. He rules it. So just because we can sometimes see how he does something, that doesn't mean it wasn't him. It was just science. I actually hear people all the time, secularists and atheists, will make the argument that these plagues make sense going in order. I'm like, yeah, but they use it as an argument that God doesn't exist. That makes no logical sense to me. That it's like A equals B, therefore 92. What? You're missing some steps in your conclusion there just because the plagues make sense in order. So frogs come up out of all the water sources because all the water is turned to blood. They come up in the land, just in the land of Pharaoh and his officials and his people. We'll see it in the next one specifically, but the Hebrews in Goshen, they don't really get bothered by this. The Israelites are just fine for these plagues. All right, for the most part. Obviously, they're still in the general region. But then the magicians do the same thing with their secret arts. I'm guessing the secret art is, just knowing how nature works. I mean, there's people out there who are naturists who can, make like pushing deer. You push deer. It's not that hard. You push a bunch of deer, hunters come out. I'm sure the magicians had some way of knowing how to make the frogs come out of their nesting areas at this certain time. Maybe it's by making a sound. Who knows? But it's not that hard because all the water sources are blood. So, of course, they're coming up into the land. They're looking for water. They're looking for a new home. And they specifically go to Egypt. So they do the same thing. Who knows? Pharaoh doesn't seem to be that impressed. But it's like, just because your guys did the same thing, that's just more frogs. Whether it was just more of frogs coming because of the Nile, because God made the Nile turn to blood, or if it was them actually all they did is make all the Egyptian wizards did was somehow make the frogs come up out of their nesting areas at that specific time. So that doesn't get rid of the plague. They just added to the plague, if they even did anything at all. It could have just been a continuation of the ones that Aaron called up. So, woo! Like, that's supposed to be their argument against it. We can do the same. Well, way to go. It's like, someone's burned their house down, a house burned down. We can start our house on fire too. Ha! Okay, this isn't a good thing, man. I don't know why you're bringing more of them. All right. So, verse 8. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." Because remember, they're still just asking for 3 days to go make sacrifices. Moses said to Pharaoh, "I leave to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile." Okay, so what is Moses doing here? It seems subtle. You might just read over that like, okay, yeah, tell me when to pray. But what he's doing is he's amplifying the magnitude of God's miracles in his divine power. Because again, it's not that these plagues are happening. The Nile's turned to blood. Maybe all that blood came from mass killing up the river of some sort. But then again, even the water pitchers in the wells all turn to blood. Miracle. But the frogs come out of their nesting areas, easily explained. What isn't easily explained by just science is how so quickly the frogs are gotten rid of. How so quickly these plagues are gotten rid of when Pharaoh asks for them to be gotten rid of and Moses prays. And, Moses could have said, okay, I'll pray. Yep. And then, a week later, they're all gone, or a month later, they're all gone. Like, yeah, I prayed. It took me this long to make my sacrifices, and now it finally happened because God made it. And it's like, no, they just left on their own. Moses knows this. He knows if he just says, okay, I'll pray, then it's not as legit of a miracle. He's like, you tell me the time. It's kind of like a magician. When they're doing a card trick, they're like, here's the card. You keep that in your head. And then they find the card for you later. You're the one, better example, I'm sorry, is they tell you to think of a card in your head. Think of a card in your head. Think of a card in your head. And then they somehow come up with the card that you were thinking in your head the whole time. That's what's going on here. Okay. You're like, how did he do that? How did he do that? How did he do that? Because I was thinking of it in my head. This is impossible. This is what Moses is doing to Pharaoh. He's like, all right, you tell me the time to pray, and I'll pray, and it'll be done then. Instead of me just being like, okay, yeah, I'll go pray, and a month later they're all gone. It's like, yeah, my sacrifices are finally done. God did it. Yay, God. No, he's going to show you the power of God by letting you pick the time and date. Pharaoh could have said, do it now, and Moses would have done it, and boom, like that. But here we go. Remember that. This is so clever of Moses, because he's getting his knowledge from God. But to tell him, okay, you tell me the time to pray. That's very overlooked, but it's very clever. I like to see the cleverness of the actions of these ancient Hebrews. They're very, very clever. Okay. So yeah, he says, I'll get rid of all the frogs except for those that remain in the Nile. Right away, Pharaoh says, tomorrow. Moses replied, it will be as you say, so that you may know there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs will leave you and your houses and your officials and your people. They will remain only in the Nile. So he's like, you need the time and place. Pharaoh's like, tomorrow. Pharaoh is a win-win for him. Because if it doesn't work, it's like, ha, 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 your God's not powerful. If it does work, all the frogs are gone. Who knows? He probably didn't really believe the frogs would be gone, but this is a way of him testing the power of Moses' God. And Moses is like, all right, yeah, I'll pray for you tomorrow. Sure, they'll all be gone. All of them. Don't worry about it, except for those that remain in the Nile. I'm sure Pharaoh, again, is thinking, okay, we'll see. We'll see. But we'll get into it in a second. Just remember, he's going to go back on his word. We know the outcome of the story. The plagues continue because Pharaoh is like, yeah, pray and I'll let you people go. Then he doesn't. But think about yourself. It's hard it's easy to say Moses and Pharaoh. Pharaoh's, just being a jerk, or what? How does he not realize that these plagues are happening? Why doesn't he just let his people go? Well, we know the economics. We've already talked about that, of why it was so hard for him to let him go. But think about yourself. Ever been in a dire situation and you're like, oh God, I'll never do it again if you just let me out of this, or blah, blah, blah. You see it on movies and stuff all the time. And not everyone has done this, because not everyone wants to like make a bargain with God. We know that's not a right thing to do. But even as a kid, I'm sure you might have been like, I'll never do that again, if you get me out of this situation, or I'll this and that. And then maybe God gives us what we're praying for. Maybe it happens, but we go back to that sin. We go back to that thing. We go back to being a selfish person in some way. It's not uncommon. So realize that Pharaoh's doing this, but we all, even Christians, will do this in our own lives. And I don't make a bargain with God, first of all, but realize that you may be thinking, oh, it's such a hard time, such a hard time. I'll be a good person if you, my father who just had a heart attack, if you get him through this, I'll be such a good person. He gets through it, and 2 years later, you're still doing the same things you were. That's Pharaoh. That's what Pharaoh's doing here. So don't be so hard on Pharaoh. Okay. After Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs he had brought on Pharaoh. And the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. What did I just say? He goes back on his word. Because it's so easy to do. When you get what you want, you think it's over. Especially if you don't understand God. You don't understand the sovereignty of God, the power of God, the majesticness of God, the divinity. If you don't understand that, and you kind of still think this is all by chance, even though he just saw that they're all dead, just like, people who are like, oh, please get my wife through this surgery. Please get my wife through this surgery. I'll be a better person. And then 2 years later, are you a better person? The next day, are you a better person? That's what's going on here. So don't just jump to Pharaoh, oh my gosh, God hardened his heart, because normally a person would see what's going on. No. And again, the economics, we've talked about this, of letting the Jewish people go. They're the labor force. If you let these people go, it's going to wreck your economy. Okay, first they're a buffer zone between you and the Canaanites and the Hivites and all these tribes, these warring civilizations, and also they are your labor force. Your wealth comes from them. So even though you're not giving any of the wealth back to them, if you let them go, but it's only for 3 days. That's the thing. But again, just remember, it's easy for us to judge Pharaoh. And I'm not making like a defense for him, but understand that this will happen. You will be put in this situation in some way, probably. Don't let your heart be hardened. Don't forget what you just saw, what you just witnessed, what you just asked God to do for you. Pharaoh asked Moses to ask God to get rid of these frogs. They are gotten rid of. Boom, right away he hardens his heart again, because the danger's over. It's past. So I don't need to worry about it anymore. They were piled up in heaps, but when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. The plague of gnats. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust on the ground and throughout the land of Egypt the dust will become gnats. They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust on the ground, gnats came on people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. Since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere, the magicians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said. Okay, again, let's explain the plague first. All the water is blood, all the fish are dead. Of course, gnats are going to come. Well, what just happened right before this also? All the frogs died now. So all of these predators of the gnats, they would probably have been keeping the population of gnats under control, gnats and bugs, under control because of all the dead animals that they're feasting on and laying their eggs in and whatnot. all of them come up. Frogs are gone, no more predators. All these dead fish, because of the blood from earlier, all these dead fish have come up on shore and stuff, I'm guessing. Now there's all these dead frogs too, no predator, and that's their environment. Again, it's easily explained through science how these things happen. You understand ecosystems and the effects of certain things. What's funny here, though, is this is the first time where the magicians couldn't recreate it, because basically, Aaron just strikes his staff on the ground and the dust turns to gnats, basically. And, it could have been all the eggs and resting there. It might not have been necessarily a magical thing. He could have just been like, but all around Egypt they came up when he struck. And again, the magicians couldn't do it this time. Since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere, the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said. So yet again, and maybe, they knew more about the environment in this time than we probably do now. So Pharaoh could have been making the logical conclusions that we're making. Oh, this is just natural. It's just natural that the gnats are gone. And he's probably thinking this, making these justifications in his head. Because again, he's going to lose the dynasty that his people for the last 400 years and more have built up. 400 years of the Hebrews being there. Even more history behind that. The greatest civilization. And they're finally redeeming themselves on the backs of the Jewish labor force and the wealth that they're creating them. He's finally building his dynasty of the Egyptian civilization to this peak, and he's inherited it from his father, and now you're telling him that the labor force that basically your economy is based on and one of your buffer zones for defense is going to be gone. He can't do that. He can't show weakness. He can't show weakness by letting him go. But God's telling him. So again, don't just look at this like, oh, God's hardening his heart. I hear this all the time from people who argue the Bible, which usually they call themselves atheists, but then they argue like moral things, like how God isn't being moral or just in a situation. And that has to start on the premise that you believe in the God. Like, how are you making a moral argument against a God that you don't believe in? It has to begin with you believing in a moral God. So even if you disagree with the God of the Bible, that's not a disproof of God. That's just you saying that's not your God. Again, I disagree with that opinion. But to make an argument against a moral, because a lot of people will say, if God hardened Pharaoh's heart, that's not just of him. So, therefore there's no God. Well, no, even in your own premise, you are basing it on a moral God. So you have to have a moral God in your mind. Otherwise, moral arguments against God as an atheist who doesn't believe in God are irrelevant. I just had to get that in there because that always annoyed me. You have to start with the premise that there's a moral God before you can move into how God is being immoral. Okay, so he's hardened his heart still. Next, verse 20. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the river, and say to him, 'This is what the Lord says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies. Even the ground will be covered with them.'" Okay. Again, I'm not going to go into it every time, but just understand what the ecosystem is going through. Flies swarming makes sense. Dead fish, gnats, dead frogs, predators gone, blood okay, this isn't, you don't have to be like environmental science doctor, okay, to understand this. It's pretty simple to understand that this is kind of a natural evolution of an ecosystem that would have gone through all the water turning to blood, then all the fish dying, and then the frogs dying. Because again, the frogs dying is not a natural thing. The frogs coming was pretty natural. The frogs dying is the real miracle. Right then. Okay. in verse 22, but on that day, so they're saying, go tell Pharaoh that there's going to be a whole bunch of flies. But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. The sign will occur tomorrow. Okay, so I said earlier, that the Hebrews weren't really touched by these plagues. I said weren't really. I've looked all over on commentaries, and there's disagreement whether or not the earlier plagues did affect the land of Goshen or not. But either case, the distinction is made clear in Pharaoh's eyes on this one. Whether or not the Hebrews suffered the frogs and the gnats, when obviously they suffered the blood, all the blood turning. But again, now I can't remember. I think the land of Goshen was spared of that too. But anyway, this is where Pharaoh sees the distinction. That's what's important to understand. Whether or not the Hebrews went through the earlier plagues or not is kind of irrelevant. You can say that's mean of God to do that. Well, you get enter through the narrow gates. You got to go through some suffering to earn the prize. Okay, you got to work hard to get the trophy. So now this is where Pharaoh will understand this, see the distinction. Now I'm all curious. Also, gnats could have been lice. Different translation. The Lord Moses. Yeah, it doesn't really say whether or not the land of Goshen was spared in the blood. But again, commentary differs. So my whole opinion on it is that it's not really important whether or not the earlier ones did hit Goshen or not, which is where the Hebrews were. The point is, this is where the distinction is made clear to Pharaoh. All right. And the sign will occur tomorrow. And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into the house of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by the flies. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land." But Moses said that would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? They must take a 3-day journey. We must take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God as he commanded us. Pharaoh said, "I will let you go to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but you must not go very far. Now pray for me." Moses answered, "As soon as I leave you, I will pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the flies will leave Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Only let Pharaoh be sure that he does not act deceitfully again by not letting the people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." Then Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The flies left Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Not a fly remained. But this time also Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. Spoiler alert. Okay, one more time about the earlier plagues affecting the Hebrews. The one thing that it always says is it affects the Pharaoh and his officials and his people. So that's why there's commentary that says that it didn't affect the land of Goshen. All you need to remember is that the flies it's not even that important to remember, but for trivial knowledge, is the flies is when the distinction is made clear to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh's heart continues to be hardened. We'll get into the plague on livestock, plague of boils, plague of hail. See, hail kind of is where it gets out of control. Because, again, after all these bugs and all this death and everything, of course there's going to be a disease among livestock. And then all these diseases among animals and livestock and everything is going to cause boils, which isn't just a disease of the plague of boils. The hail is where it gets out of control. And then the plague of locusts, which is another explainable one, you know. And after the plague of locusts, we have the plague of darkness. Again, another crazy one. And finally, the plague of the firstborn. Understand, though, first of all, I don't want to make a plea for Pharaoh as like a good guy in any way. He's not. But understand so that you can avoid the mistakes of him. Don't put yourself above, anyone else, even the bad people in the Bible. You have to learn from their mistakes too. He's in a power position. His dynasty, he's rebuilding it. The economics of their country has been built slowly for 400, but rapidly in the last 200 years on the backs of the Hebrews. They are your labor force. They're the strength of your economy. You're getting rich off of them and their work and their production value. So now they're off, and you've basically turned them into a slave class now. Just by class system, they're a slave class. And they want to go 3 days off. First off, in this, you can't show weakness. This is how they operate. This is how kings and pharaohs and ancient people would have operated. You can't show weakness like this. And who knows if they're coming back? Who knows if they're... And remember, the whole reason that they started mistrusting the Hebrews is because they thought they might go back to their land and join with the Canaanites and the Hivites to attack the Egyptians. That was one of the main reasons, because originally they were a buffer zone, and then the Hebrews became so numerous, the Egyptians got nervous and moved them away from being a military force. Their original fear was that they would go back to their homeland and join these other people to attack Egypt. So Pharaoh very, very well is thinking that this is a possibility. He's thinking as a world leader, not as someone who is humble to God. Okay? So often we put our thoughts as believers into non-believers. That it's a different operation. They have not been transfigured. They have not been transformed through the saving power of Christ. The minds do operate differently because you're living of this world. You're living for this world. You're not living for God. It's a different mindset, and you have to understand that. But we can be, I don't know, empathetic or sympathetic is the right word, but we can be understanding because we all can succumb to sin. Don't let your heart be hardened. If you know that God is calling you to do something, if you know that something needs to be done, and it's becoming crystally clear, obvious, and you even say that you will do it, do it. Okay, Pharaoh? But even more important, start slower than that. If you know that you're being told to do something and it's going against things of this world. Comedian I like, Owen Benjamin, always says fancy pants and lollipops. If you're doing things for these fancy pants and lollipops, if you're doing things to keep what you have, even though you know it goes against, or you have if you somewhat believe that it goes against what God wants, that's one of the worst things you can do. It's one of the worst. But we all fall guilty of it. You know that you sin, and you know that it's a sin. Is your heart hardened against God? All right, to leave on a positive note, we're all saved through the grace of Christ. I know we haven't gotten the New Testament yet, but we are saved through His saving grace. So no, we don't want to promote sin. We don't want to promote the desire to sin. Repent, try not to sin, but understand that you're saved through the grace of Christ. He takes your sins, and you take His sinless life. But you have to understand that. The more you understand it, the less you're going to want to sin, and you're going to start trying to move away from sin. But that doesn't mean you won't sin. It's complicated, I know, but it's really simple if you understand it. You're going to want to make your father proud. You won't always make your father proud. You won't always do the right thing by your father, but you want to do the right thing by your father. Simple as that. All right. Everyone have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or good night. God bless.